There are towns in the South that don't show up on every map. Places where the roads still breathe dust, and the air smells faintly of iron and pine. Hollow Creek was one of them, tucked deep between the hills, wrapped in fog that seemed to rise straight out of the soil. It wasn't the kind of place strangers visited. And if they did, they didn't stay long. Folks there lived by their own rules, worshipped in small churches, and believed things modern people had forgotten how to believe. Blessings. Curses. The land remembering. At the edge of Hollow Creek stood a small cabin, old as the hills themselves. The roof sagged in the middle, and smoke from the hearth always curled into the same corner of the sky. Inside lived Martha Whitlock, the woman everyone called the healer. Some said she'd been born during a thunderstorm, when lightning struck the tree outside her mother's home and split it in half. Others whispered she was the child of something older, a force that walked these mountains before the towns ever had names. Whatever the truth, Martha had hands people trusted. They brought her the sick and the cursed, and somehow, they left feeling lighter. She made poultices that drew poison from wounds, teas that quieted fever dreams. She spoke softly, rarely smiled, and never charged more than a few coins or a promise to return the jar clean. But there was another side to her reputation, one that grew in shadow. A story whispered between pews and porches. That sometimes, when Martha failed to heal someone, she didn't just bury them. She kept something. A lock of hair. A tooth. A bone maybe. And when she burned her herbs at night, the smoke wasn't for prayer. It was for power. No one ever accused her outright, of course. In small towns, suspicion was as common as Sunday bread. But it was always there, the sense that something about Martha wasn't right. Not evil exactly. Just unnatural. Too quiet. Too knowing. Then came the drought. That summer, Hollow Creek turned to dust. The wells ran shallow, crops withered, and children coughed themselves to sleep. People started saying it was a curse, that someone had offended the mountain spirits. And in a town like that, when prayers go unanswered, the blame always falls on the one who's different. So when the Miller boy went missing, it didn't take long before someone mentioned her name. He was 10 years old, last seen chasing frogs by the river. His shoes were found the next morning, still dry. The sheriff, a big man with tired eyes, organized a search. They combed the woods, called his name until their throats were raw. Nothing. By the second day, the whispers turned sharp. She's taken him. She needs him for her work. They always disappear when the moon's new. That night, the sheriff rode to Martha's cabin. The door was closed, but light flickered inside. He called her name once. No answer. He knocked again, harder. When she finally opened the door, the smell of sage and something metallic drifted out. "Martha," he said, "the boy's gone. People are talking." Her eyes met his, steady, unblinking. "People always talk," she said. "And you always listen." He glanced past her shoulder. A pot simmered on the fire. On the table lay dried herbs, jars of roots, and something else. A small figure made of sticks, bound with twine. It looked like a charm, or maybe a warning. The sheriff cleared his throat. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about that boy?" Martha's hands didn't stop working. "I know he's not dead," she said. "Yet." There was silence. He didn't know what to say to that. When he left, she watched him go, her face unreadable. Behind her, the pot kept boiling. Something inside hissed when it touched the iron. By morning, the boy's body was found, face down in the river, eyes wide open. The current hadn't carried him far. But there was something strange about him. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his mouth was filled with mud, as if someone had forced it there. People didn't need proof after that. They needed an answer. Within a day, a crowd had gathered at Martha's cabin. Men with lanterns and women clutching Bibles. No one wanted to be the first to knock, but when one man finally did, they all followed. Martha didn't run. She stood at her door, hands folded, eyes calm as ever. "I heal the living," she said quietly. "But I can't save the dead." Someone threw a stone. It missed. Another hit the window. The glass shattered. The sheriff arrived too late to stop them. By the time the mob was done, the cabin was fire and ash. Martha was gone. No one saw her leave, and no one found a body. The sheriff said the heat must have been too much. But some swore they saw her that night, standing on the far side of the creek, her dress glowing faintly in the moonlight, her hands still clean. When the rains finally came weeks later, the first drops fell on the ashes of her home. The creek swelled again, the crops grew, and life returned to Hollow Creek. People called it coincidence. Others called it penance. But in the hills, where memory runs deep, they said it was Martha, giving back what she had taken. And somewhere beneath the whisper of the trees, if you listen close enough, they say you can still hear her voice, soft and patient, asking the same question she always did. What will you give to be healed? When the rains came to Hollow Creek, they came hard. The ground, starved for months, swallowed every drop it could take. The rest turned the roads to rivers, and the rivers to veins of brown water cutting through the valley. Sheriff Eli Ransom watched the water rise from the steps of his office. He'd lived through floods before, but this one felt different. The smell in the air wasn't just rain, it was rot, like the mountain itself had opened a wound. The boy's death still sat heavy on him. They'd buried him in the churchyard a week ago, his mother half mad with grief, whispering that she'd seen something near the river the night before. A figure standing in the shallows, arms lifted to the sky. Eli hadn't believed her then. He wasn't sure he believed her now. But when the first of the storms passed and the waters began to settle, one of the mill workers came running into town, pale and shaking. "There's something down by the bend," he said. Eli saddled his horse and rode out with two men. They found it half buried in silt, a body, tangled in roots. Female. The river had taken its time with her. Her skin was pale, her hair long and dark, matted with mud. One arm was folded across her chest, as if she died cradling herself. The men crossed themselves. "It's her," one of them whispered. "The healer." Eli dismounted, knelt beside the remains, and pulled a small charm from around the woman's neck. It was a piece of twine knotted around a smooth river stone. On it was carved a single mark, a spiral turning inward. He didn't recognize it. Neither did the preacher when he brought it to town later that day. They buried her on the hill overlooking Hollow Creek. No ceremony. Just a prayer and a shallow grave under an oak tree. The preacher said words about forgiveness. Eli said nothing. As they covered the body, he felt the rain start again, light and steady. It hit the earth like a whisper. That night, lightning struck the ridge above the Miller farm. It burned through an old pine, split it in two, and rolled fire down the slope toward the fields. Eli and his men spent hours fighting it. By morning, the fire was out, but in its ashes they found something that shouldn't have been there. Small bones, blackened and fused together. Animal, maybe. Or not. The preacher said it was a sign. The town called it proof. Eli called it a question he didn't want answered. Over the next weeks, Hollow Creek tried to move on. The rain filled the wells again. The corn started growing tall. Life pretended to be normal. But something about the place felt off, like the rhythm had changed. Dogs howled at nothing. The old bell at the church rang by itself one night. And then there were the dreams. People said they dreamed of water, cold black water rushing through their houses, filling their lungs. They woke gasping, swearing they'd heard a voice under the surface. A woman's voice. Some claimed it said their name. Others said it only asked a question. What will you give to be healed? Eli didn't talk about it, but he'd had the dream too. More than once. Always the same. Standing knee-deep in the creek, fog curling around his boots, hearing someone whisper his name just before the water reached his mouth. Each time, he woke choking on nothing, his bedsheets soaked with sweat. By the third night, he stopped sleeping altogether. He started riding the outer roads after sundown, checking the farms, telling himself it was just precaution. But what he was really doing was listening. To the creeks, to the trees, to the silence that wasn't silence at all. On the fifth night, he found something strange. Near the old Miller property, the rain had carved deep gullies into the dirt. At the bottom of one lay a jar, glass half buried, sealed with wax. Inside was murky water, and what looked like hair floating in it. Human hair. He brought it back to town, set it on his desk, and stared at it until dawn. He didn't open it. He didn't have to. Every time he looked at it, the faintest ripple formed on the surface, as if something inside were breathing. The next morning, he rode back to the grave on the hill. The earth above it was wet and uneven. For a moment, he thought it had sunk from the rain. But then he saw the edges, the soil pushed outward, not down. Someone had been there. Or something had come out. Eli didn't speak of it. He couldn't. Instead, he went home, poured himself a drink, and tried to believe the world still made sense. But when he looked out the window, he could see Hollow Creek in the distance. Quiet, still, its chimneys trailing thin smoke against the gray. And for the first time since he took the badge, he wondered whether justice was ever meant for places like this. For weeks after the rains, Hollow Creek seemed almost peaceful again. The fields were green, the children played by the road, and the church bell sounded clean in the morning air. But peace in towns like that never lasts. It just waits. Sheriff Eli Ransom tried to keep himself busy. Paperwork, fence disputes, the usual small-town noise. But every night, when the sun fell behind the ridge and the crickets began, he found himself looking toward the hills. Toward the old grave. He'd stopped drinking, though not by choice. Every time he raised a glass he saw the jar, the one with the hair, sitting on his desk, still sealed, still full. He'd locked it in the evidence cabinet now, told himself it was just superstition. But sometimes when the office was quiet, he swore he could hear it. A faint clicking, like glass expanding in heat, or breathing. It was around that time that an old woman came to see him. Name was Clara Holt. She'd been a midwife once, before her hands started to shake. Her eyes were cloudy, her hair the color of wood smoke, but her voice was sharp as ever. "I hear you found her," she said, sitting down without asking. Eli didn't have to ask who she meant. "Martha Whitlock," he said. "Don't call her that," Clara muttered. "That wasn't her name." Eli frowned. "She lived here near 20 years, ma'am. That's the name on her records." The old woman shook her head slowly. "She came here from the east. Changed her name after the fire in Harker's Mill. I remember because I was the one who stitched her arm when she arrived, burned clean to the bone it was. Told me she'd lost everything. Her family, her home, her real name. Said the fire took it all." Eli leaned back. "You think she did something back there?" Clara's eyes met his. "I don't think, Sheriff. I remember." She told him about a man, a preacher's son, who'd fallen ill one winter, coughing blood. The healer back then had tried everything. Herbs, leeches, prayers, nothing worked. Until one morning, the boy woke up breathing clear, stronger than he'd been in months. 2 days later, his little sister died in her sleep. Doctors called it fever. The healer called it balance. When the townsfolk found out, they burned her house. She walked out of the flames alive, carrying something in her arms, a bundle wrapped in linen. No one saw what was inside. She vanished after that. Clara reached into her shawl and pulled something from her pocket, a small wooden figure tied with twine, worn smooth from age. "She left these behind," she said. "Buried them near her garden. Said they were tokens for safe passage. But you don't make offerings unless there's something to offer to." Eli turned the carving over in his hands. It was almost identical to the charm he'd found around the body in the river, the same spiral mark cut into its back. He felt cold. "Where did she learn this?" he asked. Clara hesitated. "Not here. Not anywhere I'd call holy. There were stories back in Harker's Mill about a woman who could trade sickness between souls. You'd give her a name, and she'd draw the sickness out of you, but it had to go somewhere." Eli exhaled, slow. "And you think she brought that here?" "I think it followed her," Clara said. "She didn't heal for free, Sheriff. She never did. When Clara left, the room felt smaller. The afternoon light slanted through the window, catching the dust in gold threads. Eli stared at the carving for a long time, then at the hills beyond the window. If what the old woman said was true, Martha hadn't been cursed. She'd been keeping something contained. And now that she was gone, it was free. That night, the dreams came back. He saw the creek again, only this time he wasn't alone. A figure stood on the opposite bank, pale, with hair like wet moss, eyes like moonlight. She didn't move, didn't speak. But when he woke, he could still hear the whisper of her voice, sliding through his skull like smoke. "You buried me, Eli. But the river remembers." He didn't sleep the rest of the night. By dawn, he was already riding toward Harker's Mill, to dig up the rest of the story. Eli Ransom rode 2 days through rain and fog before reaching Harker's Mill, a town half remembered by maps and half swallowed by time. The road wound through bare hills and broken fences, the kind of land where stories went to die. When he got there, he found only a handful of houses still standing. Most were rotting in on themselves, like teeth too long unbrushed. The postmaster was the first to speak to him. Old man, skin like parchment, eyes full of stories he didn't want to tell. Eli showed him the carving. The man went quiet, set down his pen, and crossed himself. "You found her again, didn't you?" the postmaster asked. Eli didn't answer. The man nodded anyway. "She warned us this would happen." That was how the story began to unravel, not in a courtroom, but in whispers over coffee and the creak of porch swings. They said Martha, though she'd gone by another name then, Lydia, had been tried once before. Not by law, but by the town itself. When the preacher's children started dying, people demanded justice. They dragged her to the churchyard, put her on her knees before the altar, and told her to confess. She didn't. She looked each of them in the eye and said only this: "You call it sin. I call it balance. The land takes back what you refuse to give." They didn't hang her. The preacher's wife stopped them, but they burned her house to ash that same night. The next day, half the town fell sick. By winter, most had left. And the ones who stayed learned never to speak her name again. Eli stood outside the ruins of that same church, boots sinking into the wet ground. The steeple had collapsed, the bell was gone, but the cross still leaned against the wall, charred black and stubborn. He knelt and ran a hand over the dirt. Underneath, he felt wood, a box, small and square. Inside was another charm, the same spiral carved deep into its side. But this one was different. It had 2 spirals intertwined, one turning inward, one outward. He didn't understand it then, but later he'd realize what it meant. Give and take. Heal and harm. Life and balance. When he rode back to Hollow Creek, word had already spread. Someone, maybe Clara, maybe a preacher, had told the townsfolk that Eli was digging up witchcraft. And the people did what frightened people always do. They gathered. They demanded answers. They wanted to put the healer on trial again, even if she was already dead. The town hall filled to bursting that night. Lanterns swung, shadows danced across the walls like restless spirits. Eli stood at the front, mud still on his boots, the twin spiral charm in his hand. He told them everything, about Harker's Mill, about the trade she'd made, about how the sickness might not have been hers at all, but something she'd kept at bay. When he finished, there was silence. Then someone shouted from the back, "Then she failed." Another voice rose, "You buried her wrong. You let her curse the land again." Soon, the room erupted. Fear smells like smoke before the fire even starts. They wanted to dig her up, burn what was left, bury the ashes in salt. Eli tried to reason with them, said it was madness, said it would only make things worse, but no one listened. They wanted a trial. And in their minds, it had already begun. They marched to the graveyard with shovels and torches. Rain started to fall, hard and sudden, but it didn't stop them. When they reached the hill, lightning flashed, and the oak tree above the grave cracked open like it had been waiting for the cue. The earth shifted, groaned. And when the first shovel hit dirt, it wasn't the sound of metal on stone they heard. It was the sound of water. Black water. Thick as tar, seeping up from below, filling the hole they'd made. The crowd froze. Someone screamed. And then, one by one, the torches went out, smothered by the rising flood. By dawn, the rain had stopped. The hill was empty. The grave was gone. In its place was a shallow pool, dark and still. Eli stood there alone, staring into it. When the sun rose, he saw his reflection in the water, but it wasn't alone. Behind him, faint but unmistakable, stood a woman. Her eyes met his through the surface. Not cruel. Not kind. Just knowing. He whispered her name, though he wasn't sure which one anymore. Martha. Lydia. Healer. Witch. The reflection smiled once. And the water rippled, erasing her face. When he returned to town, no one spoke of the grave again. But something in Hollow Creek had shifted. The wells ran sweet, the fields bloomed early, and people began to whisper that the curse was broken. Eli knew better. Curses don't break. They balance. Hollow Creek went quiet after the flood. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't mean peace, it means the story's holding its breath. Sheriff Eli Ransom kept working, but the days slid past him like rain down a windowpane. The townsfolk smiled again, went to church, talked about blessings and rebirth. No one mentioned the night on the hill. No one mentioned the water. But every morning, Eli found damp footprints on the steps of his office. Small, bare, and always facing the door. He told himself it was just the storm runoff. He didn't believe it. Weeks later, a letter came from the county courthouse. They'd reopened the old case from Harker's Mill, the one about Lydia Whitlock. The state wanted records, testimony, a final closure. Eli didn't know why they'd sent it to him. Maybe because he was the last man alive who'd touched her story. He went to the jailhouse archives, a stone building that smelled of mildew and time. The clerk, a narrow-faced man with spectacles, handed him a thin file bound with twine. Inside were court notes, half-burned photographs, and a single diary page, written in a hand he recognized. They call me healer, but I am only balance. I take nothing the world won't give back. One day they'll learn, the body isn't all that can rot. Eli closed the folder. The ink smelled faintly of smoke. He spent the next months helping the circuit judge catalog prisoner records from the early years. It was dull, meticulous work, exactly what he needed. Until one evening, near the bottom of a crate, he found her name again. Martha Whitlock. Sentenced in 1903. Transferred from Harker's Mill to Hollow Creek. And beneath that, pardoned by death, 1904. Only one problem. The sheriff who'd signed the transfer papers was him. His own signature. Same slant. Same flourish. But dated 20 years before he was born. He stared at it until his vision blurred. The clerk laughed it off as coincidence. A namesake, maybe a family member. But Eli had no family. His mother had died giving birth to him, and his father's name was a blank line on the church record. That night, he dreamed of iron bars and a narrow cot. Rain dripped through the ceiling, landing in a tin cup beside the bed. Someone sat in the corner, humming. When she turned her face, it was Martha. Older, calmer, her hair white as river foam. "You shouldn't have dug me up," she said. "The ground remembers who it holds." He woke gasping, heart hammering, the smell of rust in his throat. Outside, thunder rolled across the hills. The next morning, he rode out to the ruins of the old county prison. It had burned decades ago, just a skeleton of stone walls and rusted bars. In the center cell, moss growing through the cracks, he found what he hadn't expected, a carving on the wall. A spiral. Twin lines turning inward and outward, worn smooth by fingers long gone. He traced it once, felt warmth pulse under his skin, faint but real. And then he heard it again. Her voice. Soft, not angry, not even sad. "I never left, Eli. You just stopped listening." He stepped back, hand trembling. The air smelled of sage and rain. Somewhere outside, a creek gurgled to life even though it hadn't rained for days. By the time he returned to town, his badge felt heavier. He hung it on a nail by the door and poured himself a drink he wouldn't finish. In the mirror above the sink, his reflection looked older, hollow-eyed. But when he blinked for just a second, he saw another face layered over his own. A woman's, calm and certain. And he understood what Clara Holt had meant. Balance doesn't vanish. It finds new hands. The next morning, the preacher's wife came to his office, holding a jar she'd dug up in her garden. Inside was muddy water and a sprig of hemlock. The wax seal was unbroken. She asked what she should do with it. Eli took it gently, placed it on the shelf beside the first one, and said, "Leave it. Some things keep better sealed." When she left, he sat there a long time, watching the jar. In the sunlight, the water shimmered faintly, like something alive, waiting. 50 years passed before anyone spoke Martha Whitlock's name aloud again. By then, Hollow Creek was barely a memory. A cluster of houses, half abandoned, carved into the hills like initials into bark. The old church leaned to one side, its bell rusted silent. The creek still ran, though slower now, heavy with silt and secrets. That was when Samuel Dean arrived. A historian, the kind that travels alone, more at home in dusty archives than living rooms. He was writing a book on Appalachian folklore. Stories of healers, witches, and the blurred line between the two. Hollow Creek wasn't on his list, not at first. But one evening in a diner 2 towns over, an old farmer told him a story. About a sheriff who dug too deep and a woman who healed with her hands and cursed with her silence. Dean drove out the next day. He found the sheriff's office still standing, boarded up, the sign half swallowed by ivy. Inside, dust lay thick as snow. On the wall, an old badge still hung, tarnished, forgotten. And on the desk, beneath a warped layer of glass, were 2 glass jars. The seals were intact. Inside, murky water, strands of what might have been hair and something else. Something that shimmered faintly in the light, like breath caught in liquid. He didn't touch them. He didn't have to. Every instinct in him screamed that the air inside those jars was older than the room around them. In the back of the office he found a drawer filled with papers, brittle, yellowed, some written in the looping hand of a man who signed each page the same way. Eli Ransom, Sheriff. They weren't reports. They were journals. Accounts of dreams, confessions, drawings of the spiral symbol. And scattered between them, letters addressed to no one, pages that read more like apologies than records. If you're reading this, it means the water held. It means the balance stayed. Don't open what was sealed. Don't chase what sleeps. Dean read through the night. The story unfolded in fragments. The drought, the healer, the mob, the water. And beneath it all, one phrase repeated over and over again. The river remembers. He didn't believe in curses, not really. But by dawn, when the light cut through the boarded windows, he found his hands trembling. There was a sound in the corner of the room, faint but clear. A single drop of water falling onto wood. He turned. The jars were sweating. He left that morning, took the journals, and never told anyone what he'd seen. Years later, he published his book. The chapter on Hollow Creek was short, barely 10 pages, but it was the only one he wrote in the first person. They say history repeats. But sometimes it waits. It waits in the quiet places, in the water, in the soil. And when we forget, it remembers for us. He never wrote another book after that. When they found his body in a small cabin outside Asheville, the coroner said heart failure. On his desk was a single note, written in the same precise handwriting that filled his journals. The water's rising again. And next to it, a glass jar. Still sealed. Still breathing. Spring came early that year. The snow melted fast, running down from the hills in thin silver veins. The land around Hollow Creek, what was left of it, began to stir again. Wildflowers pushed through the dirt, and the air smelled of rain even on clear days. No one lived there anymore, not really. A few hunters passed through in season, a handful of families in the lower valley, but Hollow Creek itself was nothing but bones. An old well. A crooked road. A name fading from maps. Until the developers came. It started like all modern hauntings do, with blueprints and surveys. Someone from the state found a patch of flat land perfect for a new reservoir, and before long, machines rolled in, clearing what the years hadn't already taken. Among them was Rachel Dean, granddaughter of the historian. She'd grown up hearing the stories, the warnings her grandfather muttered in his sleep. She'd never believed them. Not really. But when her company assigned her to oversee the Hollow Creek project, something in her stomach turned. She told herself it was just nerves. Old ghosts don't haunt the living, she thought. Not unless you go digging for them. The first few weeks went fine. Until the crews hit water. Not groundwater, not a pipe. A cold black spring that wasn't on any geological survey. It came out fast, almost eager, flooding the trenches in minutes. By the time they stopped the dig, the lower site was already under a thin, glassy pool. Rachel stood at the edge, staring down. The water was darker than it should have been, clear but heavy. And in its stillness, she thought she saw movement. Faint ripples curling inward, forming a familiar spiral. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. She didn't know why she recognized it. Only that she did. That night, she stayed late in her trailer, flipping through her grandfather's old journals. Between yellowed pages, she found one she'd never seen before. A loose sheet tucked in the back. Written in the same handwriting as all the rest. When the land begins to thirst again, the balance will rise to meet it. The river remembers. The healer returns. She felt the wind change outside, the kind that carries rain and old voices. When she looked out the window, fog had rolled over the site. In the distance, something glimmered. Lanterns, maybe, or reflections on the water. She stepped outside. The air smelled like sage. And for the briefest second, she saw a figure standing ankle-deep in the new spring. A woman in a long dark dress, hair floating like reeds in currentless water. She wasn't young or old. Just ageless. Her face was calm, her hands open. Rachel took a step closer. The woman raised her head. Their eyes met across the surface. And Rachel heard a voice, soft and patient, echoing through her like a memory that didn't belong to her. What will you give to be healed? Then the fog thickened, swallowing the figure whole. The lantern lights faded. And when Rachel looked again, the water was still. Perfectly still. She told no one about what she saw. But when the engineers returned the next morning, the spring had spread overnight, swallowing the lower road. The project was abandoned within the month. Too unstable, they said. Too unpredictable. They built the dam farther east. And Hollow Creek, what remained of it, vanished beneath the new reservoir. Locals call it Whitlock Lake now. Pretty name. Good for tourists. But every few years, when the droughts return and the waterline drops low, people say you can still see the roof of an old cabin poking through the surface. Sometimes, they say, the lake smells faintly of sage. And on quiet nights, when the wind moves just right, a soft voice carries across the water, asking a question no one dares to answer. What will you give to be healed?